welcome participants to what I think is really a groundbreaking webcast. USAID Education in Crisis and Conflict Network, ECCN, is really pleased and proud to host this event. It's one of a continuing series of webcasts examining how we can more effectively contribute to increasing equitable access to education for those in crisis and conflict-affected environments, and how education can contribute to greater equity, resilience, and social cohesion. I'm Ash Hartwell. I'm on the ECCN support team and at the Center for International Education at University of Massachusetts, and I'll be the moderator, helping to field and direct the questions at the end of the session. Today, we really have a distinguished panel to examine the research and evidence on the role of higher education institutions in crisis and conflict contexts, and the implications for policy and partnerships. This role is really underappreciated and under-researched. These institutions are vitally important in their potential to develop national leadership that can overcome the roots of conflict and contribute to national resilience and social cohesion. Yet in cases where higher education embodies a culture of exclusion and privilege for the few, it also can contribute to drivers of conflict. But this webcast particularly examines and explores the role and response of higher education institutions in post-conflict, in post-crisis situations. The case of Haiti after the earthquake, the post-election crisis in Kenya and Ivory Coast, the long war in Colombia, and the roles of the university and the rebuilding of the education institutions in Afghanistan. Following the panel, which is going to be a very lively format with interaction among the panelists. It's not a presentation, and it's really an interaction, nice format, and they'll have about 40 minutes, and then we're going to have a Q&A period where you're invited to submit questions and comments using the chat function at the top right hand of your screen. Click on the chat and submit the questions, and of course you can do that during the presentations, and we will pick them up after the panel is completed. Just to introduce our panelists, Elizabeth Wilson from FHI 360, who is working in the USAID Higher Education Program in Afghanistan, and along with Hassan Aslami, who's from the University of Massachusetts and also working in Afghanistan on the higher education program. And then Ann Turner Johnson from Rowan University, who has studied the role of universities in the post-election violence in Kenya and in Ivory Coast, and Luis Vital, who's also at Boston College, and who has done a case study of the response of universities in Haiti. Ivan Pacheco from Boston College, who had long experience working with the universities in Colombia. And with that, I'll turn over to the first person who will give some remarks, and that's Grace Lang, who is the team leader of USAID's Higher Education Group, and she will introduce the sessions. Grace, over to you.
Thank you, Ash. Hello, everyone. It's really great to have so many of you from very different organizations joining this webcast this morning. And I do want to agree with Ash and echo his remarks about this being a groundbreaking webcast and discussion. USAID, through our current education strategy, has been focusing on early grade reading, education in crisis and conflict, and mostly at the primary and secondary levels, but also higher education, tertiary education, and workforce development, especially for youth. And we haven't had as much a focus in that last area on the role of higher education institutions in these crisis and conflict contexts. And I'd just like to start off the discussion this morning by sharing some of my experiences in such contexts and working with tertiary education institutions. I had in a previous assignment with USAID worked in both Afghanistan and Haiti, and so I'm very much looking forward to hearing the discussions on those two countries. They're very near and dear to my heart. But in Afghanistan, with the situation being that the universities practically drained of all of their skilled staff and faculty, rebuilding starting in the year 2003 was very important. And USAID, through many, many different sectors, not just the education, but economic growth, our democracy and governance programming, all kind of attacked this problem by working with all the universities across the country, helping to rebuild academic programs, helping to start new ones, and doing extensive amounts of work in faculty development. And I know that work continues, and I'm very interested in hearing the speaker on Afghanistan and what's going on now. And also in Haiti, where access to higher education is out of reach for many young people, and the importance of getting young people into universities, into fields where the economy is demanding skilled labor, and where graduates can, in effect, once they're employed, pull an entire family out of poverty. And that really helps to create a middle class in the country and helps serve as a stabilizing factor. So with that, I'll turn the presentation over to Michelle, who will introduce how higher education can be used to rebuild areas in post-crisis countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace. And greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. So the overarching theme for our session is that institutions are trying to rebuild post-conflict, post-crisis, but not just on an institutional level, but on a country level as well. In this presentation, we discuss what is needed to strengthen, rebuild, reinvigorate, and reestablish institutions. We will discuss policy as it relates to institutional policy, but country-level policy as well. And then we discuss partnerships between institutions, both in-country and abroad, between institutions and communities, and among institutions, including NGOs. Anne, turn on your mic.
Thank you. Sorry. In this presentation, we're going to frame conflict and crisis in various contexts, predominantly at institutions in the global south. And we're going to explore how higher education policy and practice is being enacted in these contexts and provide you with some examples as well. And we'll underscore how higher education can increase stability in contexts characterized by crisis.
Framing crisis and conflict is sometimes a different tab, because crisis and conflict is an umbrella term that includes a wide array of situations. The way these situations affect higher education also varies. In many cases, universities are destroyed or crippled, and in some others, they are able to continue functioning without major disruptions. We will present now a brief description of the conflicts, emergencies, or crises from our different countries of the study, so that you can get a better picture of the context for our research. Colombia, for example, has a conflict that lasts over half a century, and it has endured a long active, or it's perhaps the longest active conflict in the world. However, it has been a low intensity and mostly rural conflict involving several guerrilla groups and other groups. The intensity of the conflict has varied across the time, but during the conflict, the higher education system has grown in number of institutions, in number of students, and quality improvement has been a constant concern.
My work addresses election violence in two sub-Saharan African nations, Kenya and Cote d'Ivoire, characterized by short periods of high-intensity violence. Election violence is pervasive in sub-Saharan Africa because there are rarely constraints on politicians' behavior. Such is the case for both of the elections that provide the context for my research. Both countries are ethnically heterogeneous and culturally diverse, where politics may serve as a disguise for ethno-religious differences. In Kenya and Cote d'Ivoire, the universities were disrupted by student unions associated with particular political parties and were targeted by the community due to their diversity and access to resources.
So prior to the 2010 earthquake in Haiti, the higher education system there was characterized as a slow-moving disaster. And so the earthquake that occurred pretty much turned higher education upside down in the country. And so my research involved conducting a case study of an NGO who was addressing issues of access and persistence in the Haitian higher education system in their direct work with university students. And what I learned from that time after the earthquake is that given the magnitude of the challenges to higher education in Haiti, which may be unique to this context, a key factor for success is to leverage existing relationships, local and external, to develop short and long-term action plans in response. Those relationships help the NGO, but also help to address the immediate needs related to maintaining continuity of higher education, as well as quickly assessing the resources and supplies needed for learning, determining how to support teachers and administrators, but also drawing from the expertise of higher education actors to determine how to craft a plan for rebuilding. And that's what's been going on since that time.
Research is in Afghanistan, and it's based on three particular partnerships. One, there are three of them. They're all with a U.S. university and an Afghan university, and they're part of a USAID-funded project called University Support and Workforce Development Program. And the goal of the partnership is to develop a new market-oriented degree program. And the setting, which Hassan will give some background on.
Afghanistan suffered a lot due to the almost 4 decades of war. Started with the Russian invasion, followed by the civil war and Taliban regime. Afghan government with its international allies still fighting many opposition groups, and the war also caused a lot of damages to the universities, as many of them destroyed or remained closed for a long period of time. However, there has been a lot of improvement since 2001. And for example, now there are 38 public universities compared to 7 in 2001. And we have 130 private universities compared to 2 newly established universities in 2006. Currently, there are over 300,000 students enrolled in higher education institutions compared to merely 7,000 students in 2001.
Higher education takes many forms and plays a variety of roles around the world. It's now axiomatic that higher education serves society seeking to address public problems through research, service, and teaching. Here we'll address predominantly public and private four-year institutions, their partnerships, and their critical engagements with development. Despite the very real capacity challenges many higher education institutions face, a promising body of scholarship demonstrates that higher education has positively impacted development, particularly traditional economic indicators such as per capita income. Intimately tied, development via higher education lends itself to stability and continued investment in creating educated and peaceful citizenry.
In terms of policy and practice, proximity, either geographic or ideological, are really key in this process. When we talk about geographic proximity, we might define it as like the distance between higher education institutions and the main cities and places where decisions are taken. Political proximity is the degree of alignment and compatibility of the institution's ideology, mission, and identity from those of the government or other structures of power. While geographic proximity usually plays in favor of higher education institutions because it provides better access to money, skilled faculty, and other requirements for the existence of the institutions, sometimes it is in remote locations where higher education institutions can make a deeper impact. The picture that you can see here is from Utopia, a branch campus of the Universidad de La Salle in Colombia. While the main activities of this university take place in Bogota, which is Colombia's capital, the Utopia campus is located in Yopal, 350 kilometers away from Bogota. Through this project, Universidad de La Salle trains as agricultural engineers a small number of students from rural backgrounds who have been also victims of the conflict. Seclusion is, by design, one of the main features of this project. Now, in terms of relationships and political investment, in Latin America, service and outreach is considered one of the three substantive missions of higher education. A great variety of activities that we can consider as peace-building efforts can be covered under this mission. But even before the signature of the peace agreement within FARC and the Colombian government, universities have been taking many of these actions. For example, some universities created a pool of centers to provide legal assistance to people displaced by the conflict. And in another case, universities have been providing help to and special places for students who have been combatants from different groups.
In Kenya, relationships with the community were critical to capacity building. The university many universities prior to the conflict had poor relationship with the community surrounding the campus and came to see community engagement as a possible solution to that relationship. Sending students and faculty into the community enabled the institutions to extend their academic values into that community. Engagement in this context was fundamentally about sharing resources with community members and connecting this to organizational reform. In Côte d'Ivoire, congruence between university needs and government decision-making was key to rebuilding the institution after it had been destroyed during the contested national election. Post-conflict reconstruction, particularly of universities, needs the input of a variety of actors, including students, particularly because of their power in the political process in many sub-Saharan African nations. So procedural norms needed to be established that provided opportunities and venues for these various constituencies, including students, to voice their own needs and goals in the rebuilding process.
So in Haiti, the NGO I conducted a case study on, although functions independent of the Ministry of Education and the university system, does have established working relationship with members of those entities. But they've also collaborated with local NGOs and organizations to leverage opportunities for the university students that they serve. So they have partnered with these organizations to offer leadership development and enrichment activities. They've partnered with local businesses to offer internships and really created a pipeline from university to career. They have partnered with organizations outside of Haiti to offer academic and fellowship opportunities for these students. And so all of these partnerships have expanded the learning and academic opportunities for students, ones they probably would not have had access to otherwise if they were not affiliated with this organization.
Afghanistan and following these partnerships, one of them is between Kabul Polytechnic University and Kabul Medical University, partnering with Spokane Community College on a degree, and Kandahar University and Johns Hopkins University, and the third is with Herat University and Purdue University. In all of those three situations, those three partnership relationships, it's very clear how at both the administrative level of the universities and the faculty member level, there's individual commitment to rebuilding. Money is not the primary goal of working together. It's really trying to, in the long run, rebuild a system and making that so that's a long-term contribution to the economy of Afghanistan in the end.
So what can universities, the higher education systems do when crisis happens? So one of these is addressing issues of security. Institutions in fragile contexts must ensure the safety of their campus constituencies. They may do this through the creation of risk reduction plans. These plans should include the capacity building of students and staff and faculty to withstand and respond to conflict. It needs to map the vulnerability of the educational spaces and borders of the campus. train administrators in emergency response, and develop and routinely revisit safety policies. This should also entail the creation of a properly vetted and appropriately trained security personnel. In Cote d'Ivoire, immediately post-conflict, a security force was created on campus that actually increased insecurity due to politicization of the process, such as hiring unemployed youth affiliated with particular political parties. After a strike on campus over insecurity, the force was disbanded, and collaboration between police, military, and the ministry, the university established a new security protocol.
In Afghanistan, it's a very fluid situation. As I mentioned, the partnerships are meant to respond to the current needs of the Afghan economy and be market-oriented training for students. And so the U.S. partner is coming with very up-to-date technical knowledge, but not necessarily all the contextual understanding. So a really important part of the partnership is communication. And when the U.S. partners can't come because it's very dangerous, or the Afghan partners can't go to be with the U.S. side because of visa issues, in all the partnerships, they've created some workarounds, whether that be meeting in a third country location or really relying on virtual communication. But then virtual communication, of course, necessitates electricity, stable internet connection, and the necessary technology. But communication is something that in this environment is really important to being successful, and the partners are really aware of that.
Institutional policy during conflict and crisis really does need to be revisited. This requires agency, investment, and problem solving, and the authority to transfer policies and practices on campus. Administrators may be able to be flexible and adapt and create programs and services in a way that disrupts the sort of business as usual attitude, thus acknowledging the changing needs and abilities of students, staff, and faculty during conflict. For example, insisting on examinations during a crisis may lead to the creation of new grievances on campus. In Kenya, university administrators chose to suspend fees for a semester during the election violence and worked with the government to establish an emergency trust fund for exceptionally needy students.
Universities are usually in a very privileged position in terms of how they can interact with their communities. Sometimes they can participate in short-term activities, and very often they can take also part of long-term efforts. Sometimes they are key elements in peace building efforts. In the Colombian case, many universities have worked with, as we mentioned before, displaced people, former combatants, and people from their communities. One example is from the Universidad Tecnológica de Cartagena. They facilitated the reincorporation of a group of former combatants to their new communities by developing a productive project that involved not just the former combatants, but also the communities in which they were involved, their new communities. This project consisted in a professional music and dance performance, and it was successful for a few years, perhaps.
So I know I keep emphasizing partnerships, but given the magnitude of the challenges to higher education in Haiti, and especially issues related to capacity, which may be unique to this context in some ways, I do think emphasizing partnerships is quite necessary. One positive thing that I want to note in Haiti is that it is more than 7 years removed from the earthquake, and great work has been happening there, although more needs to occur. And so I would say that a key factor for success is to leveraging key relationships or existing relationships, both local and external, to develop short and long-term action plans in response to crisis if something like this were to ever occur again. But these relationships will help to address the immediate needs related to maintaining continuity of higher education, quickly assessing the resources and supplies needed for learning, determining how to support teachers and administrators, but also drawing from the expertise of higher education actors to determine how to craft a plan for rebuilding, how to partner with other higher education institutions within and outside of the country to address breakdowns in specific programs, and finally, I think most importantly, determining budget and financial needs to minimize the disruption to higher education.
So what frameworks emerge post-conflict that can help institutions engage in establishing and help to build stability in post-conflict contexts? One of the ones that I often come back to in my own research is the use of community engagement as a critical framework to use when reforming and rebuilding universities after conflict. Engaging the university's ability to cut across conflict lines, which may have really very important implications for civil conflict outside of the ivory tower, and initiate a changed relationship with the community that may contribute to overall healing. In Kenya and in Cote d'Ivoire, universities undertook different forms of engagement to do just this. Specifically in Kenya, Moi University created programs that involved faculty and students in community outreach and engaged them through research on conflict and peace building that helped to address some of the underlying conditions for violence in the community.
In terms of improving values and identity, ensuring gender equity is the top priority for Afghan universities. Now females make 20% of the student body and somehow similar percentage for the women faculty compared to almost none in 2001. In the 3 programs of our research, the university implements affirmative action or quota system to increase the number of female students in our program. For example, at least 30% of the students in these programs should be female. However, there are still some campuses, especially in remote areas and conservative areas, where there are few student applicants for the higher education. So therefore, additional support is needed and to be provided for the females in order for them to apply and matriculate in higher education institutions besides implementing quota system.
Bye, buddy.
For the area in terms of teaching and learning, let me talk about that one. In the partnerships that we're following along with, each of them has a blueprint for how they're going to be building these programs, and part of that is making sure that there are staff who have the master's degrees or the PhDs that are required by the Ministry of Higher Education to sustain the program. With the curriculum, making sure, again, like I mentioned before, that it's very up to date and it's what the students are going to be needing to get jobs in the market once they finish. We have a partnership with the one that's with Harat University and Purdue, where they have been very deliberate in setting up this model, and with the faculty are developing needs assessments in the community that the university has set, and making sure that their curriculum is including the things that their students will need to be doing when they finish. So they're both increasing the skills of the faculty to do research, and then they're also making sure that the curriculum that's being taught is relevant.
So I'll be talking about partnerships to supplement student learning. And so a key component of the framework we're discussing now is to determine strategies that will speak to student learning and academic success during times of rebuilding. An important factor will be to partner with those entities, community-based organizations, local companies, funding agencies, higher education institutions in neighboring countries when possible, which was critical for Haiti after the earthquake, to be innovative in how to contribute to student learning, even if or especially when traditional teaching and learning cannot occur. Most importantly, developing frameworks ahead of time will be critical so that when emergencies do occur, the frameworks we've discussed can be quickly implemented and the impact of student learning can be minimized.
Okay, Luis, I think you just had the last word from the panel, but now we have a good deal of time. You've been right on time. Good work, panel. And you've raised a lot of issues, very interesting, and I now really want to invite those who've been listening to click on that chat box up at the top right-hand side of your screen, and send us some questions. And we'd like to initiate this dialogue. And I'll say that even if we're not able to answer all the questions that are posted, those questions will be available on the website, and we will ask the panelists to respond to those even after the webinar, so that this is a continuing conversation and interaction. So we'll hope to have some questions from you. I'm going to start out to prime the pump, as it were, to ask the question: what role should supranational organizations play in ensuring the protection of higher education in these contexts? In other words, what is the role that we could see? Luis and everybody spoke a lot about partnerships. How can supranational organizations help with the issues of security and protection that you have pointed out? A really vital question, since, as we know, in some cases, universities have been victimized directly by the crisis and or the conflict. So I put that back to the panel and maybe turn to Anne.
I'll happily take that one. I've written about this quite a bit in my research. But there are many organizations invested in and actively seeking to protect education from attack. Many of these organizations tend to be focused on primary and secondary schools, as Grace mentioned earlier, as they're seen more valuable in the development and peace process. Yet the tools created by these organizations, when adapted according to contextual needs and organizational differences, I think really have some significance for higher education in conflict contexts. These things include, which I mentioned already, risk reduction plans, zones for peace, placemaking for peace, education clusters. These are different tools that are being used by organizations. One organization is the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack. Another is the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies. There's also UNESCO's Education in Emergencies. Also, one that I go to quite a bit is the Project for Public Spaces, and that's the piece that I was talking about as it relates to placemaking for peacemaking. And then IIE Scholar Rescue Fund is doing a lot of really important work and helping to protect scholars who are threatened in conflict nations or under different conditions, truly. So I'm actually going to paste some of these resources now into the chat box and share it with everyone.
That's really useful. And so that those who are listening, as well as those who will be looking at this webcast after it's over, will be able to access those resources. Very, very helpful. Thank you. Is there anyone else on the panel? That was a great response. So I think we have another question. This is from Grace Armstrong. How do you address the problem of endemic corruption in relevant ministries of education in working with higher education institutions? When we see issues of, in areas of fragile states and crisis and conflict, the problem of corruption is non-trivial. And I wonder if there's some responses to that question.
Well, that's a tough question. I guess the answer we can provide is basically regarding to corruption in any other level. So the first thing is addressing it as something that exists. You have to acknowledge it as a current risk and take some measures to prevent or reduce it. One of them is trying to be as transparent as you can with your contractual and hiring and other processes. But this is one of the risks of being in a post-conflict situation and in developing countries. And we have seen some examples of that in Colombia. And the answer is that universities should do their best to be transparent and open to the public, but together they might not be able to fight corruption. They will need the support of their communities and their society.
Right. I think that's a very important point, that this isn't something the universities can deal with just on their own, but it comes back again to that point that everybody on the panel has been making about the need for relationships that allow you to make such behavior more public and accountable. I wonder if other people on the panel might have particular cases or stories that they can share without incriminating anybody that address this issue. It's
Yeah, I can say something because unfortunately Afghanistan is at the top of the list of corruption. I think we have a lot of improvements, but what has been very successful in the context of Afghanistan is that improving rule of law, and the media played a significant role in reducing corruption in administration in public institutions in Afghanistan. And also the second way to reduce or minimize corruption is involvement of people and publics in all development activities and in all aspects of higher education or any other institution. And so these two elements, which is involvement of publics and media, was very helpful in the context of Afghanistan. But in addition to that, we should also work on a systems to create the system in a way that there should be less involvement of individuals rather than to be more functional system. One of the good examples of this system is, they call it nowadays in Afghanistan, in many public institutions, including the university, one-stop shop. So you are not in contact of many people to do your work, but you should just refer to one place in one office, and you can give your application, and that will be processed from one point. So there are different mechanisms in the work to reduce and fight the corruption, but maybe at the top of all of these will be a strong decision and political commitment from the administration and maybe in the institutional level, in the government level, or even in a very lower level of society.
great. Thanks, Hassan. Anyone else?
Sure, I'll just mention that, oftentimes, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, the institutions themselves are complicit and some of the corruption that occurs in the educational system. So back to Yvonne's point about being transparent and hiring processes and these sorts of things. I know in Kenya there's been a lot of effort to sort of address this at the university level and at the ministry level. I recall being in an interview with a participant who was a registrar, and they had behind their desk a big poster that said, "Report public sector graft." So I thought that was really interesting because the person's interacting with students. They may not understand what public sector graft is, but I appreciated their attempt at trying to address issues of corruption in the registrar, where students may have to pay for access to their records or various sundry other things, more than what would we be expected under the circumstances. So I've definitely seen efforts at the institutional level to try to address these issues.
Thanks. And actually, this behavior is so important because it actually establishes a model, as it were, for the society as a whole. Because if the higher education institutions are not able to show reasonable integrity, then it's certainly not going to be likely in other places. Grace, I think you've been wanting to make some comments about this.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a little bit on to what Hassan was saying about Afghanistan, and that in the early days when USAID first reopened in Afghanistan, one of the big issues in the university system was that there hadn't been degrees, university diplomas, printed in many, many years. And because of the very rampant document fraud that can take place in Afghanistan, USAID worked with Ministry of Higher Education to purchase the kind of degree or diploma paper that we use in the United States, to print diplomas and to help their operations going forward, to reduce this one small part of corruption in Afghanistan. So large-scale efforts and even small-scale efforts can go a long way.
Yeah, as they say, the devil is in the details, and that's the detail that is not a detail to the recipient, and is the subject. The issuing of diplomas in Pakistan, for example, is quite an operation, and very, very important, those details. So thank you. Okay.
Another small, sorry, Ash.
Sure.
Another small example, actually, it's a big example that our project has also been supporting is more transparency in the college entrance. There's an exam called the COMFOR exam, and so we've been working with the Ministry of Higher Education, even with the equipment that is used, so that the people who take the tests are actually the people whose names are on the paper. There's a biometric aspect of the equipment that's been provided to the ministry, and it's done a lot in terms of public support, and that there's equity across the country, that the people who take the test really do have a chance of getting into the university because of the equipment, that infrastructure.
And that is a point, of course, where there is a lot of inequity and corruption in fragile systems, in systems where the university becomes a point of access for those with privilege, and it's often abused. And so this is very critical, what you've just mentioned, systems of assuring transparency and equity in admissions. Yeah, thank you. All right. We're looking for other questions and issues. I'd like to pose one in addition that is a fairly broad question, and that is this, that in conditions of crisis and conflict, it's not as if there's a single event. Very often there are, as in Colombia over the years of the conflict, periods of relative peace, and then there are periods of conflict. And USAID actually describes the state of latent conflict before a conflict breaks out, but where the indicators are that there is a high risk that it might do. And the question I have is how higher education, in this panel, we have really focused on how higher education responds to a crisis or a conflict situation. But what role can the university play in helping to defuse what is a latent conflict stage and can lead to it? And bearing in mind that universities have been the starting points of conflicts in quite a number of countries. So what role do the universities have to play at those times when, let's say, the pre-conflict?
So I can jump in on that one. Again, I think one of the most important roles that universities play, but that has been long neglected in a lot of places, including the global north, is this notion of community engagement as this third mission of the university. And I keep coming back to how important community engagement on the part of the university is in order to develop systems that protect the institution, but that also help to extend the academic values of the institution into the community. And this can be, so I often, again, come back to this notion of placemaking, and that by doing that, by creating this strong networked relationship with the community, that it's not just the institution that can be protected, but that the community itself can be protected during the conflict because of various sundry projects that the institution can engage with pre-conflict, like conflict resolution workshops, like additional educational services, offering employment opportunities to the community. This is actually a really critical issue when institutions can be seen as ethnic enclaves. by only hiring people from certain ethnic groups. So by offering and being more transparent and offering employment opportunities to those in the surrounding community, then that increases the situation as to why they would want to attack the institution that employs them. So this becomes some of these, which seem fairly straightforward. Some of these things can really be very useful in creating sort of addressing some of those underlying conditions for conflict. And I mentioned a lot of the work that Moy University has been doing with the help of Indiana University and various sundry other organizations to really address some of those conditions, so that when the next election comes up, there will be less of a likelihood that the institution will be attacked and that the community will find itself less engaged in violence.
Great. Thanks very much. Yes?
May I jump in this question? Hi. I just wanted to say that this is like the typical question where you have the theoretical university and the university in reality. So in theory, yes, universities can do many amazing things to contribute to peace, but there are many challenges, and mostly in a pre-conflict stage. As you mentioned, Ash, very often conflict starts or at least finds one of its hotbeds in universities. And that's something that we cannot ignore. But even if that's not the case, and universities want to do something specifically targeted to diffuse the conflict in a pre-conflict stage, and this is just a vague generalization, but I would say that governments aren't very inclined to pay attention to what universities have to say in that specific stage. That said, of course, they can get engaged in creating development, mostly economic development conditions. And if those efforts are successful, that might help to diffuse or somehow to delay the conflict. But that is a very difficult dilemma for the person here and for a university to have.
I totally agree with you, Yvonne. Actually, it's interesting. I remember doing some of my work in Kenyatta University, and participants telling me like the government doesn't want to listen to anything that we have to say. They're not really looking to us as they should be for input on these issues. And I remember distinctly one participant who was an administrator at the institution saying, like, we have to take our own agency. We have to at the institutional level, do what we can to address these conditions with or without the assistance of the government. So I do think that there are institutions that are making attempts at addressing these things at the institutional level and at the community level. But your point about what the government who the government includes at that table and who they don't include is a really important one.
Thank you. That just raises the whole issue of the complex relationship between government and higher education, the degree of autonomy, the degree of politicization, and I think in each of the cases you've described, there are different profiles of that and different strategies. So thank you. There was another question from Grace, and this was what. Her observation is we shouldn't vilify developing countries on the issue of corruption, since it's not just a problem in developing countries or fragile states, but it's a very widespread problem. And the question is, what about the newer models of tertiary education that are emerging and are changing the nature of the field? And how are these newer models? How are these influencing both corruption as well as the issue of the university's role in crisis and conflict? I think, Grace, you may want to ask that question yourself.
Well, I think I have a response, not necessarily in response to corruption per se, but in response to challenges within the higher education system in Haiti. And so one university that I've been sort of paying attention to is the Institute of Science, Technology, and Advanced Studies of Haiti, or ISTIA. And what they're doing, which is a bit differently than what's happening in Port-au-Prince, is that they are really casting a wide net looking for faculty to support the teaching and learning at their university. And so they'll offer their courses in a compressed period of time, like 2 weeks or a month, depending on the course. And they invite faculty not only from Haiti, but Canada, France, United States, and other French-speaking countries to come in, take 2 weeks or a month off from where they work full-time, and offer these courses in a condensed period for students. So students are having access to world-class education from faculty all over the world, but then they're also being able to progress through their master's or their graduate degree programs in a way that's not always available in other higher education institutions in Haiti. And so they've been around for some time, and they are expanding the different learning and knowledge centers as well as the degrees that they offer. And I think that this is maybe not a disruption to higher education in Haiti, but definitely a complement or speaking to issues of capacity as it relates to tertiary education in the country.
That's a great example of how having innovative schedules and organization allows greater partnerships to take place, both internal and external. That's a really fine example. Thanks, Louise. We're coming close to the close of our time, and I'd actually like to turn over to Grace, who we have a few more minutes if there's any other question or any other comments that the panelists would make. I just wanted to say one thing. I really like the emphasis that you have all made on the nature of support through stronger relationships at community levels, within other sectors of the economy and of the country, and with external institutions. I've been involved over the years with the Institute for Education Development in Pakistan, which established very strong linkages internationally, and it really helped it through a series of developments. And I think that's really a helpful framework to think of. Thank you.
So, Ash, I do have an additional comment outside of any particular question. So I know that those of us on the panel have been talking a lot about, frameworks in relation to crisis and conflict and how do you address rebuilding efforts. And I think our emphasis on partnership and policy is definitely key. But one thing that I learned in my research in Haiti, and Anne sort of alluded to this, is the voices of students or maybe even recent graduates, right? Because they are the ones who are existing within the higher education system. They can speak to what is going well in a way that perhaps those on the outside cannot. And I think as conversations about rebuilding higher education, the system itself, it's really important that students and recent graduates are part of those conversations.
Yeah, I'm so glad you underscored that. That's been so important, and particularly in the work that I've seen and done in Côte d'Ivoire, how students can hold things up even. They have so much power, and they are not afraid to use it. And so by not including them or disempowering them in these processes, you're creating the conditions for future problems on campus and in the community. So by ignoring students and the power that they have, universities are really putting themselves in a precarious position. So I'm really glad that you underscored that.
With the project in Afghanistan, we've also been supporting a new gender policy. Actually, it's a anti-harassment and what's the other piece? But it's a lot to do with things that happen to female students on campus. And we're helping one of the universities pilot this new strategy from the Ministry of Higher Education, and part of that is to develop some committees that follow through the process of bringing cases to resolution when they occur, so there's a way to report them and a way to follow through and resolve. So part of those committees, students are involved in that process. So it's not just this implemented by the administration, but it's really trying to really change behavior and the way conflicts at more of a civil domestic level are addressed.
You may have something to contribute to the need of addressing this in U.S. universities. Not a joke, actually.
Can I say something about the role of universities in reconstruction? And it is very easy, either post-conflict or post-crisis. It is very easy and very tempting to say that since universities have the human power and somehow they have an organization, it is easy to believe that they are able to do whatever the government or someone else can. And there were a couple of examples in Colombia where universities were directly engaged in the construction of roads. I mean, universities made contracts with the government to build roads, one of them at least, or to take one part of that. And I think it is a risk to do that type of things because that is not the role of universities, and by doing so, you can get really entangled in a situation that the university or the city will not be able to manage. It is important to keep in mind that universities are institutions of knowledge and yes, of course, research and outreach, and they can take part in these type of projects, but not by doing things that other institutions are supposed to do.
That's a fairly radical example of a misuse of community outreach for universities. Thank you. I think we'll, Grace, I'm going to hand over to you to have some closing remarks, and I just wanted personally to thank you so much for all the work that has gone into this panel, and to have all our participants know that the resources that are behind this are on the ECCN website, and that the video of the panel and this session will be available. And I encourage you to have your colleagues who are not able to join us also tune in. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ash. I did just want to thank the panelists for the last set of comments about not forgetting that just because our work in higher education may be focusing on academic performance and making universities stronger, that we shouldn't lose focus on the fact that students are our youth, and they're a great resource. And there are a lot of things that we can do to improve their agency and their power in their societies. And so after the presentation's over, I will share some resources with everyone on USAID's work through its Youth Power activity on soft skills and soft skills measurement, soft skills research, as well as other resources on youth engagement. Our youth work tends not to be focused so much on university students, and so I'm really happy the panel did spend some time focusing on that. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for their time, thank the panelists so much for all of their great work and all of the food for thought that you've given all of us this morning.
Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, I just want to thank USAID for this opportunity to share the work that all of us have spent our careers focused on. And so this is a really great opportunity to really share that with others. I know what we do is sort of a niche. Like you mentioned earlier, higher education there has not been really a lot of focus on that due to this very stringent and strident focus on primary and secondary education. So I know that I'm really happy to see organizations starting to pay attention to the role of higher education in these contexts.
I agree. I'll just finish by saying one of the takeaways I had from my research is one of the participants said, well, you can't run a country with just a high school education. And that really underscores, I think, the need for higher education systems in Haiti. And from our respective contexts, I think hopefully we highlighted why attention to higher education specifically is really important.
Yesterday, we were at a chancellor's forum for the universities of 11 public universities, and this was hosted by the U.S. Embassy and the ambassador. remark that there's the continuing commitment of USAID and the U.S. people to support higher education in Afghanistan, and I was really impressed by his emphasis on these are institutions where we pursue truth, and we want to support people, youth who are gaining knowledge. It's a holistic, it's part of a larger international community. So we appreciate the work of USAID in Afghanistan.
And with that, we are going to close our webcast. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us.